All right. It's been a while, but I've made it back. Another solo episode. I'm going to try and bang out a few of these over the next week because I've got a couple of disrupted weeks and I want to keep these rolling through. Today's topic is going to be frequency, training frequency. It's something that I've had a lot of discussions with online because I'm openly critical, I guess you could say, about high frequency training. And there's some reasons as to why I feel that particular way. And I'm keeping emotion out of this and focusing on experience more than anything. But I wanted to give a brief overview on training frequency, on my thoughts on training frequency, on why high training frequency isn't necessarily the answer to your problems and why it could be the source of some of your problems. And so I guess a good place to start with this is looking at some of the science and the issue with sports science in general, especially when it comes to powerlifting particularly, is that a lot of the studies that are run on things like strength gain are done in a very short-term fashion. So a lot of the studies that you'll see on high-frequency versus low-frequency training, for a start, they're very sparse. There's not many studies done on that. So like the knowledge and information that we have on high-frequency training is purely from an anecdotal point of view. Like someone's just had some success with it and then said it's God's truth and now everyone thinks it's God's truth, or a lot of people think it's God's truth. It's not based on rigorous scientific evidence. The studies are generally short-term, like 10 to 12 weeks, which is not a good picture as to whether these are long-term solutions. Studies in this case are often done on untrained individuals, or when they are done in trained individuals, they're not accounting for a lot of other training factors that we know are true and influential, things such as like technical control, things such as the programming as a whole, like what other factors do we do in our program that lead to success of strength in a particular lift, and so on and so forth. So studies are not the best source of information in this particular case because there hasn't been long-term studies done with the controls that we need to really understand whether or not this is a viable solution for long-term strength gain. So the studies are generally limited, are generally poor. Studies are not the best source of our information. We need to take anecdotal evidence, and anecdotal evidence is, of course, going to be not the best source of evidence because everyone's going to have a slightly different experience based on the methodology that they use. And I can speak from anecdotal evidence for high-frequency training. I've implemented high-frequency training with my lifters in the past. I've done squats and deadlifts of up to 3 times a week, benches 4 to 5 times a week. Personally, I've done more than that with bench press frequency. I've done silly things like double shaker, CMX programming, where you're doing like 8 benches in a week. I've seen both ends of the extreme. And I guess the best way to then cover some of this when we're talking about frequency is to look at some pros and some cons. So I want to start by looking at the pros of high frequency training. And I guess really this argument is going to center around bench press because bench press is the thing that people tend to drive the frequency up of the most. And there are some benefits that come with a high frequency approach, which is why people end up doing it in the first place. If there were no pros, if there were no benefits, no one would do it, right? And so there are some things that you can garner a positive response from doing a high frequency approach, especially with something like bench press. And these are normally the arguments that people will have for taking a high frequency approach as well. And as we go through, I'm going to show you how they might not necessarily be the best arguments. So the first pro that I want to touch on is skill acquisition. This is the one that people will say most often is like the element of practice. And of course, if you go from 1 bench a week to 5 benches a week, you're going to have a lot of practice on bench. That's a given. And so there can be a rapid improvement in someone's ability to execute the skill of bench press or the skill of any lift by increasing the frequency of that lift. That is going to be a pro, for sure. You're going to get better at it by doing it more. Yeah, that you can argue that, absolutely. I think the biggest pro and the thing that actually drives the most change for people that switch to a higher frequency approach is the general mindset shift that you get. So I feel like, okay, I bench 1 or 2 times a week and my bench is not where I want it to be. I'm going to switch it to 4 or 5 times a week. All of a sudden, not only are you just adding bench, but you've identified bench as an issue for you and you've shifted your mindset to an improvement mindset where you're going to put a hell of a lot more effort and energy into improving that lift directly. So it's not just the fact that you're benching more, it's the fact that you've now got a dedicated focus on making that lift better. I think there is an enormous amount of benefit to be said for this. And again, I'm going to be first to admit, I am not a proponent of higher frequencies. I'm a proponent of low frequency, of 1 times a week benching, sometimes twice. But if I have a lifter who I feel is going to benefit from the mindset required or the mindset that's going to come, even if it's as simple as they've come from a higher frequency background and they're really finding it hard to digest the idea of benching less, I may implement another bench press across the week such that they feel comfortable, such that they bring the right mindset to training when they're doing that particular lift. So I think there's a huge benefit in the mindset shift that can come with a higher frequency approach. I want to pause on this for a second as well and just say, I actually hate the terms low frequency, high frequency, because it's low and high relative to what? Like what is normal frequency and therefore what is lower than normal and what is higher than normal? Because for me, I would say normal frequency or adequate frequency is 1 times per week. So if you double the dose and do twice per week, I would class that as high frequency. If you're doing 6 times per week, I mean, that's ultra high frequency. So it really comes down to your definition of what low and high is. I guess if I were to pick apart what, the average is, you'd probably class low frequency when it comes to bench press, especially as like 1 to 2 times per week. High frequency is like 4 to 6 times per week. For all intents and purposes of those listening, when I say the words low and high, that's probably what we're touching on here. So the other main pro, and I believe this is one of the major reasons why you see a rapid increase is again, picking on bench press, when people move from low to high frequency, is a rapid uptake in relative intensity. So one of the key drivers of progress is going to be consistent intensity. And in fact, I'd say the key driver of progress is going to be consistent intensity because that's what's going to satisfy the principle of progressive overload. It's like there's the progressive, which is doing more, and overload, which is doing more weight. It's like the load over time, progressive over time, load on the bar. Ultimately, if you have an uptake or an uptick in intensity, there is going to be improvement. And so when you add a whole bunch more bench in, you're bringing the mindset, you're improving the technique potentially, the skill potentially. You're also rapidly increasing the fatigue in that lift, which is making each bench session harder. So you're getting a rapid increase in intensity. And with that, with the combination of all those things, you're going to see a rapid increase in the weight on the bar. You're going to see an improvement in bench overall. And the same could be said for squat and deadlift. People increase their lifts rapidly with a high frequency approach temporarily or in the short term. It's not necessarily a great long-term solution. That's kind of where we start to shift in towards the cons. Because ultimately, yeah, there are pros, the mindset shift, the improvement in technique, the uptick in intensity, and so the rapid improvement in the numbers that comes with that. The question is this sustainable in the long term? The gift of experience is foresight, and I can tell you with confidence that it's not. The people that have been around the longest are not using a high-frequency approach. There are a lot of people using a high-frequency approach that are going places quickly. It'll be really interesting to see if they stay in those places or if they continue to make improvement. Because the downside to high frequency is that the rate of injury tends to improve and the rate of the rate of injury tends to increase and the rate of stagnation also tends to increase. A lot of people go up quickly with high frequency and then stop dead in their tracks. And this is one of the major cons. So the first major con to high frequency training is that it's built on a flimsy premise. So like it's almost like a juvenile premise. It's the premise that we have when we start in the gym, which is like, if I do a little bit more than I did last week, I'm getting better. If you extrapolate that out, if you zoom out, that's what high frequency essentially is. It's maxing out every week. It's doing it more every week. And that's just not how it works. It's not a long-term sustainable approach. The bitter irony of this is, if you take a coach who is a proponent of high frequency, like ultra high frequency, 5 to 6 times benching per week, and you apply it to any other movement, like let's forget squat, bench, deadlift. You walk into the gym, you see big Larry. Larry's on the rows and he's rowing the whole stack. You're like, Jesus, I want to be like Larry. I want lats like Larry. I want Larry's lats, and I want to row the whole stack. Coach, what do you think I can do? What do you think I should do to get there? Guarantee even the high frequency coach is not going to say row 5 times a week. No, they're going to say row once a week, maybe twice, go a little bit heavier, add some volume, progress it over time. That's how you're going to get stronger on that movement. Why do the rules change all of a sudden when we get to bench press? That is the weird thing. And again, like I'm going to go all Eminem and, lay it out, and the damaging admissions first. The cards that people will play is things like, upper body recovers quicker than lower body, so we can do it more often. Yeah, that is kind of true, but should you? Like, why don't you do that with every other upper body movement? Why don't we train all of it 5-6 times a week? Why is bench all of a sudden the exception? That doesn't make a great deal of sense. Well, there's the skill improvement component. This is the weird thing. I find this comment weird. I know I said it was a pro, but the question is, do you need to be doing it truly that often to improve the skill of it? And again, why is it okay to improve the skill of everything else once or twice a week, but bench all of a sudden we need 5 or 6 times? It's built on the lie that bench is a high skill movement. It is not a high skill movement. Anyone who's got a couple of years experience in powerlifting, you can go without benching for a block, for 2 blocks, for 3 blocks, and within a couple of weeks of benching again, you'll feel the same old self that you did before. It is not like swinging a golf club where you need to practice every day. It's not like, high-level NRL, where even then, high-level NRL, they're only playing the game a couple of times a week. Like, the skill practice required for high-skill activities is not as high as people are making it out to be with bench press. That doesn't make any sense. You don't need to be doing it that often for skill acquisition. That's just a lie. That's just a nice way of packaging up some sort of justification to do it more often. Do some soul searching. Do you really need to bench that often for the skill? Probably not. You could also make the argument that too much of something actually decreases the skill by virtue of complacency. And I mean, that's not the strongest argument to make, but it is an argument you could make. I see this a lot with especially people going through rehab processes. Like if you've had some sort of injury and you're given some rehab exercise and the physio's like, do it once or twice a week. You're like, nah, I'm going to fast track. I'm going to do it 7 times a week. I'm going to do it every single day. It's quite easy then to get complacent about the performance of that thing and not tick the box of what you're actually trying to achieve. You just start going through the motion. And I mean, this is the scourge of powerlifting. I teach my lifters the mantra: if you think you're tight enough, you're not. Get tighter. People think they're getting hard into position and tight into position. When you're there barking at them, squeeze that thing tighter, guarantee there's more to squeeze. And so if we look at this as like the skill of bench pressing, if you're doing it every day, it just becomes routine. You just get a little bit relaxed about it potentially. So there is that argument to be made. I made the point of, in the short term, it's going to ramp up the intensity. In the long term, it's going to do the opposite. And this is why people stagnate. So you get this ramping up of intensity because of the inherent fatigue that you're going to get from doing something every day, or 4 or 5 times a week. Then you're going to get a rapid stagnation because of the fact that you can't continue to add intensity because you're always lukewarm. And so that's going to be an issue with bench press, especially when people are doing it 4 or 5 times a week, is that it's quite hard to push beyond what you're doing. What people eventually end up doing is just doing the same bench week every week. Yeah, I'm doing my top single, then I'm doing my sets of 4, then I'm doing my 6s and 8s and tempos and whatever else you have to add in fluffy stuff to make up those 5 or 6 days a week, which kind of adds another point. Training works in phases. You develop qualities in certain phases. So like there's hypertrophic qualities that happen in certain intensity ranges, which is garnered by certain rep ranges. There's strength qualities, and those things have to build upon each other. And if you're trying to do all of them at once, like you're trying to do a conditioning block, a development block, a strength block, a hypertrophy block, and a peaking block all in 1 week by having these multiple different sessions with multiple different qualities, you just kind of get shitty at all of them rather than really good at one of them. And that's going to be one of the issues with high frequency bench press is what do you even do with all that bench press? What are you doing? And you end up crossing phases and not building upon the qualities that are going to then periodize into the next phase. I don't know why periodization has become a dirty word in strength training. It's definitely not. It's how training works, and it's how all sports tend to progress. So don't be afraid of periodization. Don't be afraid of developing qualities and building upon them. This is a major one. So a major con that comes with high frequency is that it can detract from the work required to actually make progress, to actually drive strength. So in most pursuits in powerlifting, like squat, bench, deadlift, the rate limiter is generally the technique itself. So if you look at a squat, the rate limiter is very rarely leg strength. Your legs tend to be strong enough. You tend to fail a lift because you've lost your brace or because you've lost your upper back. Same thing can be said for bench press. The rate limiter is very rarely the strength of your pecs, which are going to be the prime mover in that lift. Often the rate limiter is your ability to maintain a stable base to press from, so your upper back and your shoulder position. That's pretty much it. You lose that, it makes it really hard to bench. When you go into high frequency benching, what people tend to do with that can handle high frequency benching, because this is kind of unique, right? People with a long range of motion, people with an ugly flat bench press, not a super duper arched up, super arched, wide grip bench press, they tend to not be able to tolerate high frequency bench press programs. People with a really big arch, with a short range of motion, with an ultra wide bench, they tend to lend themselves more to being able to tolerate high frequency bench press. And they've done this by maximizing their leverages to the point where bench is not all that fatiguing. So they can lift heavy more often. Just in the same way that an ultra wide long arm sumo deadlifter can do heavy sumo deadlifts more often, or it can do it without creating too many problems. The question is then, should you? And so you come back to this whole idea of like the pecs are often not the rate limiter in bench press. In those situations, they are. And the irony of this is that bench press in that fashion, so ultra wide, super big arch, is a terrible way to develop pec strength. And so they bench 5-6 times a week, their pecs never get stronger. And that's the thing holding back their bench press. And if you're doing that much bench press, it takes away from all the accessory work you could be doing to actually make your bench press stronger. Here's a good litmus test for this, right? So I don't believe in strength ratios. Like I don't believe if you deadlift this, you should be able to RDL that. If you squat this, you should be able to leg press that. I don't believe in that. However, a good test of relative pressing strength to your bench press is that you should be able to dumbbell bench about 50% of your bench press, so 25% of your bench press per hand for like 6 to 10 reps pretty comfortably. So if you bench press 100 kilos, half of that is 50 kilos, 50 divided by 2, one per hand is 25 kilos. If you bench 100, you should be able to do the 25s for like a comfortable 6 to 10 reps. If you can't do that, pec strength is an issue. Pressing strength is an issue. That's holding your bench press back. And I've seen this so many times with people I've coached that have maximized their arch, that have ultra wide grips, whose bench has, the problem is like with people like that, their bench is relatively really good. Like they tend to be good benches compared to everyone else, but they get blinded by the fact that they're a good bencher to the fact that they're not making any progress with it. And one of the ways to fast track the progress, okay, you've maximized your position. Now you need to get juicy and strong so that you can put that strength into the position and lift more weight. High frequency bench press is a direct barrier to being able to do that. That's really the main cons that I've got written out here. So like to summarize, one of the hard things with getting away from the mindset of high frequency bench press, and I'll leave on this note, is like, if you are the kind of person that has, struggled with bench, then you've found success with high frequency bench press for the reasons that I've mentioned earlier. You get this rapid uptick in intensity, you develop the skill, you get better at benching, you bring your mindset and you've done that from going, 2 days a week benching to 5 days a week benching. If or when you have stagnated, you go back in time, you're like, how did I get over my last stagnation? Well, I added more bench press. And the problem is if you're sitting at 5 days a week of benching, you've kind of got nowhere where to go. You start adding bench days where they don't belong. You end up at 6, maybe even, a couple of double sessions of bench press. Your only solution cannot be adding more bench days because you are going to run out of days to add. So eventually you're going to have to do something about the fact that your bench isn't moving. And the answer is not adding more days. You have to figure out the answer to that question. And what I'm saying with this is maybe the solution wasn't adding more days to begin with. Food for thought. You can get strong without benching 5 times a week. You can get strong benching 1 time per week, and I can show you plenty of evidence of people who have done that. Interesting discussion on frequency. And I just want to layer and hammer home the point one more time. I'm not actually altogether against higher frequencies. I think there are pros that could be obtained with higher frequency bench pressing. I'm not saying they're the absolute worst. I'm just saying you have to proceed with caution. You have to understand why they're working, if they're working, and more importantly, know when to stop doing it, when it stops working. Hope that helps. Catch you next time.